Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the second part of the summit. Nice to see you all here. This session is going to be about effective outreach and what leading universities from around the world are doing to reach more low, middle-income students in schools and communities. So it should be a really good session. As Peter said, I'm James Turner, so I'm Director of Programmes at the Sutton Trust, and we have a really great panel of speakers to kick off this session. And then in the second half of the session, there should be plenty of time for questions and answers from the panel. So our first speaker, who we're really delighted to be here, is Rebekah Westphal, the International Director of Admissions at Yale. Rebekah's actually a Brit, having completed secondary school here and then crossing the Atlantic for her university studies. So she has a really useful Anglo-American perspective. She's been at Yale since 2005 and now has a particular focus on admissions from Europe and Africa. We're particularly pleased that Rebekah's here because she's been a great supporter, as Peter said, of our US programme. And she also has a poorly little girl back in New Haven, so we're very grateful that she made it over here at all, and she has to fly straight off to get back there after this session. So thank you very much for coming, Rebekah, and I'll pass over to you for your presentation. So thank you.
Thanks, James. I'm very happy to be here. I'm just going to put my stopwatch on here. So happy to be here. So we're going to talk a little bit about outreach, both our international and domestic outreach. And at first glance, one might ask the question, outreach? Why on earth do you need to do outreach? You know, last year at Yale, we had almost 30,000 applications for 1,300 places. And the majority of students are academically qualified to come to Yale. As one long-time former admissions officer once said, in this job, you are doomed to succeed. But every year we hit the road travelling across the US and the world. We spend hours updating our online presence and send hundreds of Yale students to high schools across the globe. And we do this for several reasons, lots of reasons. But one of the reasons I want to focus on today is to make sure that the students from every background know that Yale would not be a burden financially if they were to be admitted to the university. So Yale is in the very fortunate position of being able to offer a need-blind admissions process. This means that a student's ability to pay for Yale or not has no effect on the process of evaluating them as an applicant. We offer need-based or means-tested financial aid. We guarantee to meet 100% of a student's demonstrated financial need for all 4 years of their bachelor's degree. Families don't need to take out loans, and last year our financial aid budget was $120 million. Families with incomes of less than $65,000 a year pay nothing for their child to attend Yale. Almost 60% of Yale students receive financial aid, and many pay less than $5,000 for tuition, room board, books, etc. Yale became need-blind for international students or non-US citizens in 2001, and we've been need-blind for US students for almost 50 years. So Yale's been focused on making the university accessible for a long time, making sure that the most deserving candidates based on academic and personal promise are there. And it's accessible for them. We also offer fee waivers. Unlike the US, where it's one fee for UCAS, to US institutions, it can be $75 or more for each application. So that can really add up once students are applying to 5 or 6 different universities. Those fee waivers are critical. You don't want the cost of applying to become the first barrier to students who want applying. So now you have the context for our research. I'll talk a little bit about our international research. We do fairly targeted recruitment to places where we've seen great students before. And when time allows, we do branch out to new places. But we manage to travel to most major cities around the world every year or every other year. Bear in mind, we're not simply trying to drum up more applications. We're making sure that the right kind of students are applying to us. We also do a lot of public service when we're on the road. We give workshops to schools and students on the application process. We talk a lot about student life on US campuses and the scholarship opportunities across the US, not just at Yale. There are many fantastic universities in the US offering great scholarships, both merit-based and need-based. But by far our most successful work internationally has been done with sponsorship organisations. We work closely with a number of groups that work specifically with high-achieving, low-income students. They help students with the application process, often provide SAT tutoring for free, that's standardized tests that we require, and sometimes even cover the first flight to the US, and also immediate personal expenses like a computer or a warm coat, particularly useful where we are. I put a couple of examples on the slide. Zawadi Africa, which works specifically with young Kenyan women, and the United States Achievers Program, or USAP, which is now in 17 countries and works again with high-achieving, low-income students. But these organisations don't just stop at the application process. Once the students arrive in the US, they're part of large networks of students who have come before them. Both Zawadi and USAP have annual conferences to which all members are invited. Education USA is also another group that we work closely. They come under the umbrella of the US State Department. They offer free advice to students who want to study at the graduate or undergraduate level in the US, and they can be found in 170 countries around the world. Here, they work in conjunction with the Fulbright Commission and are frequently housed in US embassies. Education USA advisors are often locals, understand the schooling systems, help us plan visit to schools, and they are one of our most useful outreach tools. Last year, Yale, or in 2012, Yale hosted the first summer session for the Sutton Trust US program. 65 students sampled life at Yale for a week. This year, we hosted 100 students, and the program had a slightly more academic focus. Students heard from some of Yale's most well-known faculty and even got to study the US Constitution. It has been a fantastic partnership, and while we were seeing a growing number of state-schooled students in our pool, I will say with the Sutton Trust we are seeing a different pool of state-schooled students, high-achieving, low-income students, and we have 5 who just started their freshman year. Domestically, our research has taken a slightly different turn this year. It was very interesting hearing Dr. Jerem's research that he's been doing. In February 2013, Caroline Hoxby at Stanford University and Christopher Avery at Harvard Kennedy School released a research paper called The Missing One-Offs, the hidden supply of high-achieving, low-income students. The paper demonstrates that a significant number of academically qualified students do not apply to selective private and public institutions because they believe that these schools are not affordable. This is specifically in the US. And I quote from the research: "The vast majority of low-income high achievers do not apply to any selective college. This is despite the fact that selective institutions typically cost them less, owing to generous financial aid, than the 2-year and non-selective 4-year institutions to which they actually apply." So why aren't they applying? And it basically comes down to a lack of information. Some of the lessons that we have learned from this research, that low-income students least likely to apply are the most geographically dispersed, so in rural areas, that mail works, that having something in hand rather than just reading about something online, particularly if it's coming from a third-party group, so from a community-based organisation or a sponsorship organisation, is particularly effective, that families should be able to compare costs between institutions, and that fee waivers, as I mentioned before, are critical. So what are we doing? We've changed the way we're travelling, not just to major cities in the US, but particularly with our ambassadors program, we are branching out. So I'll make sure I'm not going over time here. We have put together tailored mailings to high-achieving high school students who live in census tracts or zip codes, postcodes, where the median household income is less than $65,000 US. You can see here from this next mailing, one of our mailings here, it mentions the $65,000 cutoff, the average price paid by Yale students on financial aid, and then connects students to our companion website, which you can see there. The companion website, which I show just a sample here, compares the average cost of Yale for students receiving financial aid to what they would actually pay at most state universities. So you can see there some of the differences. We also mention how students can apply for a fee waiver when they apply through the Common App. So this is something we've just done over the summer. We don't have any data on trends in the pool, as we're seeing from this, but we're hoping that we will see some change in our pool. Another thing that we're doing is we have been partnership with Questbridge since 2007. This is a matching program for high-achieving low-income students. Applicants apply through the Questbridge program to Yale, And this has been a very, very effective programme in bringing a really different kind of student into our pool. We also have an ambassadors programme internationally and both domestically. We make use of the students who are heading home for the breaks, for either Thanksgiving break, winter break, summer break, and we ask them to visit high schools to talk about their experiences. This Thanksgiving, we have 200 students visiting 500 schools in over 40 states. Internationally, we do the same thing. Students heading home for the breaks, visit a couple of high schools. It's a great opportunity for high schoolers to hear directly from current students, and quite different from the kind of presentation I would give, for example. Internationally, the visit is also a little bit different because we ask students to talk a lot about their experiences simply as an international student, about the cultural differences, etc. Outreach, of course, extends beyond mailings and high school visits. Students respond to the kind of support that you offer students on your campuses. And so we talk a lot about this too. Last year we started a programme called Freshman Scholars at Yale, which is for a select group of students. It's a 5-week programme over the summer, which gives students the opportunity to engage early with the Yale experience. It's targeted towards students who may need a little bit of extra time to transition successfully to the university. All students receive 1 credit or class, which is then put towards their first year requirements. So it takes the load off a little in the first year. We also have extensive advising right from the word go. And for our international students, a 4-day international orientation, even before the regular orientation, which gets down to the very basics of getting a bank account, a cell phone, orienting them to the US culture, shopping for winter coats, etc. I will say there's no question that what we're doing is time intensive, but I think the benefits for the students are huge. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rebekah. Great, well, that was a really good way to get us started, so thank you. And there'll be plenty of time for questions to pick up on some of the things Rebekah's talked about later on. At this point, I'll introduce our next speaker, please, which is John Beard from the University of Cambridge here in the UK. John is Director of Undergraduate Admissions for the university and is so really at the sharp end of the university's significant efforts to widen access. The Trust and Cambridge have got a really long-standing and positive relationship. And the university runs our largest UK summer school programme, actually. I think it's 500 students almost this year. So we're delighted to have you here, John. Thanks for coming, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. I've been warned about time limit, but I didn't realise there was an app for that. So if I do overrun, please do so. Just a little by way of personal biography. I attended a comprehensive school in the UK, which closed part-way through my education there, nothing to do with me. I then went on to a further education college, and I attended a 1960s campus university. My family travelled approximately 10 miles in 400 years in terms of where they lived, and so you don't often hear the words Norwich, cosmopolitan and glamorous in the same sentence, but for many of my relatives, being in Norwich and seeing the bright lights there was something to behold. So I really say this by way of just illustrating the fact that I come from a non-traditional background. I was employed by the university coming up for 6 years ago now to lead on their outreach efforts and also to head up the Cambridge admissions office. And my attitude really was that Cambridge is a global leader in many fields, and so really we should be a global leader in this particular area as well. So we've launched a very ambitious programme to increase the level of outreach work we do. Just a little bit about the university's profile. We receive 15,000 applications for about 3,200 places each year. Highly selective. 80% of the students who apply to us go on to get at least 2 A stars and an A at A level. In a given year, we turn away around about 6,000 students who go on to get straight A's. So it's incredibly selective. We also have a needs-blind admissions process. Our stated aim is to admit the best and brightest wherever they may be from. We have every interest in pursuing the widening participation agenda. Our lecturers want to be as stimulated by their students as we hope the students are stimulated by them. We want to make sure we've got the very most able students at our institution. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some of the work that we do. So to begin with the summer schools, we run Sutton Trust summer schools. Next year we're hoping to increase numbers to about 540. But overall we have places on a range of summer schools that add up to about 850. Those are the ones that are run by the university. The individual colleges also run summer school programmes, which will probably take us somewhere into the 1100, 1200 kind of mark. So it's a big endeavour for the university. We focus on first generation students. They tend to be from low progression backgrounds and neighbourhoods. We also have strands for particular groups where we think the issues are particularly entrenched. So we have summer school programme for mature students, for FE students, for Black, Asian and minority ethnicity students. But a very big endeavour and keystone to our outreach activities. As you may have heard earlier, we've been involved for 15 years now, and we hope that we continue for many more years to come. In terms of individual initiatives, one of the oldest outreach initiatives we have is our GMA initiative, which is focused on ethnic minority students. In recent years, we've fine-tuned the programme. We've retitled it BAME Communities. And we've gone from quite a flat programme to something that's far more progressive. So we engage with students in years 10, 11 and 12, because our sense is that if we're going to deal with some of the issues that this particular group face when they're applying to university, we need to start with a much younger age group, and you need sustained engagement with them from that point onwards if you're really going to have traction, if you're really going to make a difference. But one of our oldest programmes. We operate our outreach activities on a national scale, and here are two examples. The first is our national conferences. We know that there are students who may be vaguely considering going somewhere like Oxford or to Cambridge, but don't have enough of an interest to make the journey down to one of our open days. And so what we do is we run a series of student conferences with the University of Oxford around the UK. You've got a sense there of the geographical spread of those events. They're held in stadia. They reach about 8,000 students a year. These are all students who could apply to Oxford or Cambridge. So they're very different to the kind of higher education convention, the kind of trade fairs that we also attend. Critically, 1,000 teachers attend each year as well. And at those events, we have a full programme. We don't just talk about entry to the university, we have subject sessions as well, so you can find out in more depth about the teaching and learning that we offer. So, very large scale events, and quite unlike the activities that many other universities offer. We also have an area link scheme, which was established over a decade ago. And the principle here is that every Cambridge college, and there are 29 that offer undergraduate programmes, is linked with a local authority in the UK. Every local authority in the UK is linked with a Cambridge college. And this means that each college has a responsibility for that area, and it gives us incredible geographic reach. And again, just to give you a sense of that, we reckon that through this scheme, we engage with 55,000 students and 4,000 teachers in 2,500 schools every year. So another example of the scale of the endeavour at the University of Cambridge. We run teachers' conferences, and there are two sorts. We have a mobile teachers' roadshow that we take around the country, but we also have a teachers' conference at the university itself. We run that every 2 years, and we have around about 300 teachers from state schools who spend 2 or 3 days with us. It's a residential programme, and it gives us an opportunity to discuss in detail our admissions process and the work that we would do, and indeed to discuss with them what we would like to get from them. We have a very wide range of specialist programmes which I won't go into detail about for the sake of time, but I'm happy to discuss any of them. But we have specific programmes for care leavers. Children in care are one of the most underrepresented groups in higher education today. We run challenge days for younger students, and that's really to give them a taste of higher education. Subject masterclasses, which again give a sense of what it's like to actually study as a student at the university. And we have individual strands that are focused on FE students and on mature students. One of our more recent approaches to outreach is a project called HE+, and this actually chimes with something that we've already heard. It's reckoned that there is a group of students that amounts to around about 3,000 or 4,000 students who each year get the grades that would put them in the running for somewhere like Oxford or Cambridge, but they don't apply to us Now, a number of them don't apply for very good reasons. It might be that we don't offer the subject that they're interested in. It may be that they're tied to the local area for personal, social, economic reasons. But nonetheless, there is this body of students that don't apply to highly selective institutions. And we wanted to know how we could gain access to this group. We think that they tend to be singletons in their school. They tend to be the student in the school that year who could apply. They don't have peers to talk to about their aspiration because no one else is applying. They can't talk to their families about it because they could be first-generation students. And their teachers just aren't used to dealing with these kind of students on a regular basis. Very, very difficult to get to, even if you've got something like our Area Link scheme. And so we thought, okay, well, what if we adopted a kind of consortium approach to this? And what we would do is we would find a hub institution that had a strong record of producing applicants to Russell Group universities, and we would connect them with schools in their region where they had a weaker record, but nonetheless they had bright students. And we would connect these singletons into a much bigger community where aspiration was the norm. And we would see whether this had an effect on the people who previously weren't connected in this way. Currently we've got 10 consortia, and as you can see, again, they're geographically quite widely spread. We have another 2 or 3 coming online this year, so we are growing the initiative. Currently there are 1,700 students engaged. These are all stellar students, very, very bright, very good academic record from 50 schools. And what we do is over the course of a year, I've said here year 12, but actually it seeps into year 13 as well. Over the course of a year, they receive extension classes which introduce them to topics that are beyond their curriculum. We offer them master classes, so we have university academics going along and talking in depth about a particular topic in relation to their subject. And the students are invited to visit the university. But there's a sustained range of interventions throughout year 12, so we keep on coming back to them. It's a very new initiative, been running for 3 or 4 years now, and we're still assessing its effectiveness, but that's something that I'd like to come on to in a moment. There are lots of other things that we do, which I don't unfortunately have time to discuss at the moment, but we estimate we spend around about £2.7 million per year on our outreach programme. The title of the presentation was Outreach, What Works? And my experience and one of my frustrations is that there's a lot of focus on doing outreach, going out and doing this work, and yet no one ever really knows whether it's had any impact or not. And one of the other decisions that I took at a very early stage is that if we're going to do this work, we need to make sure that we are getting return on our investment, and we're doing something that's actually useful to the schools, the students and the teachers. So we've been assessing our impact quite carefully over the last 3 to 4 years. And here's just some figures that give you a sense of the impact that we think we've had. We engage with around about 120,000 students per year, about 10,000 teachers. We evaluate our events just to make sure that they're delivering the kind of things that they should, and so we ask people about their experience. So we gather that kind of data, but we also gather quantitative data. We want to know if they are applying to university and if they are applying to us. And we know that 35% of students attending our core programmes, so that's our summer schools, HE+, those kinds of things, 35% go on to apply to the University of Cambridge. And in excess of 25% of those students are offered a place. This is actually quite an important figure. 25% is slightly above our usual conversion rate. So if you apply to the University of Cambridge, then about 22-23% of students are made an offer. The students coming through these programmes, at least 25%. Bear in mind that these are students that come from the harder to get to backgrounds. They're students who are disadvantaged or underrepresented in some way. So the fact that it's higher than our average is actually quite important. The figures are much higher for certain events. The Sutton Trust Summer School, we know that 95% of the students who attend that programme go on to apply to higher education somewhere. We know that at least 50% apply to the University of Cambridge, and again we know that 25% secure a place at the university. HE+, quite interesting. There was more of a focus on attainment here rather than application. Of course we want more people to apply to us, but we also want to make sure that we improve their chances. And with a programme like HE+, because you're giving them subject input, you're actually helping them with their studies and hopefully improving their attainment. And the schools that are engaged in HE+, have an average success rate of around about 35%. Much higher than our standard 22-23%, because the hub institution is a real powerhouse for Oxford and Cambridge applications. Initial data suggests that the chances of a student who's involved in the HE Plus programme of securing an offer from the university is more like 44%. So we know that it's having an impact. In terms of the university standing overall, despite the introduction of a higher tuition fee rate and initial dip in applications to higher education generally, applications to the University of Cambridge have actually gone up over the last 2 years. They've gone up from the state sector as well as the independent sector. And also, and almost counterintuitively, the number of applications that we've received from students from low participation neighbourhoods has also gone up. So we think that we're having some impact. Our state sector entry is its highest in 30 years. You saw some figures earlier that suggested our intake of state sector students was around about 58%. Last year it was actually 63%. So that's 7 or 8 percentage points higher than it was 5 or 6 years ago. So we do believe we're having an impact. I think one of our key frustrations in terms of assessing impact is getting the data and knowing what it means. We know how many students apply to us, and we have a sense of how many might be applying to institutions like Oxford, but we don't have a very good grasp of how many students are applying, for example, to other Russell Group universities. And we don't necessarily have a very firm grasp of how many are applying to HE full stop. And we're partly up against the fact that there is no unique learner number for a student, so it's very difficult to track them through the system. So a lot of our matches tend to be quite fuzzy. And we have to pay for this data. We have to go to UCAS and provide them the records, and it takes time and it's expensive. But we think that it's really important that we do this so that we know that what we are doing is actually worthwhile. There remain a number of challenges. I've mentioned the systematic tracking there, the wider impact, good baseline data. If we admit 100 Black Caribbean students a year, is that good when you compare it to the number of those students that are getting the highest grades? We don't necessarily have that data, and that would be very important baseline data to have. I think ultimately, at the end of the day, the two biggest issues for us are attainment and misconception. We've heard today that 25% of students' attainment can't explain away why they didn't apply. Nonetheless, that means that for 75%, attainment was the issue. But misconceptions, which are perpetuated by the press and the media. It's not a particularly good story if the University of Cambridge admits lots of students from very ordinary backgrounds. And we are constantly having to convey the message that actually if you come from a low-income household, actually you could get a very generous financial package if you come to Cambridge. Actually, if you come to the university, you can fit in very well because there are lots of other people like you at the university. Very difficult to get around these misconceptions. I've kind of added as a kind of afterthought here A-level reform, and I won't unpack that in any detail right now, but we are deeply concerned that the loss of choice and flexibility in the A-level examinations will result in students making poor choices which they cannot later correct. And we're also concerned that without mid-term assessment, students won't have the confidence of their grades to say, actually, looking at my profile, I could apply to a Russell Group university. So that's a major concern for us, and we are concerned about what that will mean for widening participation in 5 or 6 years' time. I'll conclude there.
Great, thank you very much, John. Great, well, thank you, John. And last but by no means least, I'm pleased to welcome Aline de Salinelles, the Director General of the Fondation Dauphine in Paris. As you'll see from your delegate packs, Aline has been involved in this area since 2008, when she helped to develop the Equal Opportunities Policy at the University of Paris Dauphine. She's been leading the Foundation's considerable work in this area since 2011. And so we're very much looking forward to hearing about that work and having a French perspective on these issues as well. So thank you very much, Aline.
So thank you very much for your invitation. I will try to give a French outlook on those questions. As you told, I'm the managing director of the Dauphine Fondation, which raises money among alumni and firms to fund this very important program for us, which aim is to be sure that every able students can apply to Dauphine and be accepted, whatever his background is. So the foundation runs and grants that program. Maybe a few words about University Paris-Dauphine, very, very briefly. Paris-Dauphine University is a selective university which is specialized in decision and organization sciences. It's based in Western Paris, the very posh 16th arrondissement, which has an impact on our message to all able students. We have bachelor, master, and doctorate degrees. A master degree in France is 5 years and not only 4 years. Bachelor 3 years and then master 2 years in addition. We have a small number of students, 9,000. 800 in first year and 2,500 graduates per year in Master 2. And we have more than 80 masters, very well known for business, finance, and management. And in addition, the fees are very, very low. It doesn't cost anything for the first 3 years, and then it depends on the parents' income. It runs from €0 to 4,000 euros, so it's quite reasonable. The policy equality of opportunity aims at enabling able high school pupils, what we call lycéens in France, so our lycée is our high schools, from so-called disadvantaged suburbs to apply Dauphine and to enhance their chances to succeed in. That's why the university launched that specific program in 2009, financed by the Fondation, and the whole Dauphine community is part of the program. That's quite important. That means the students, the professors, alumni, and the administrative staff. And the program has been acknowledged by the French government in 2010. So what is our action for the high school pupils? A lot of things are quite comparable to what Cambridge do, as far as I heard a few minutes ago. So the first step is to give information about Dauphine. To ensure that every high school pupil can know what Dauphine is and can have the idea to apply to Dauphine. It means building bridges between so-called disadvantaged suburbs around Paris and our elite university. But it is not enough, it's not sufficient to ensure that every able high school pupils can enter Dauphine. That's why we proposed and we launched additional lessons in high schools, that means before A level, 2 years before, so that the high school pupils can boost their academic level and prepare admission and be admitted like every other pupil in Dauphine in first year. But we have a slightly different applying process for them than in Dauphine. We created a so-called Commission Égalité des Chances, which runs interviews to have a more comprehensive look on the pupils from our high school partners. And when the pupils are admitted in Dauphine, they are mentored by 3 types of mentors: an alumni, a teacher, professor, and students. So very briefly, we launched a 3-year program which begins in high school, so before A level, to build bridges between disadvantaged areas and Dauphine. So information, open day, and all that. Plus what we called Parcours Dauphine, which are additional lessons. We give chances to the pupils to boost their academic level. Then they can be admitted in Dauphine, and we do not leave them. We created a kind of mentoring program so that they can succeed in Dauphine if they come. So a few key figures to at the end of that presentation. So we launched, the program is relatively young. We launched it 4 years ago. We have 24 high school partners just around Paris right now. Our strategic goal would be to expand it in France, but right now we are concentrated around Paris. We have more than 150 mentors, students, alumni, professors of Dauphine University. And we received a total amount of 360 applying forms since 2009. Maybe those pupils would have never applied to Dauphine before, we don't know. And we admitted more than 100 students since 2009 through that particular program. And just to have an outlook for those maybe who know Parisian suburbs, that is the list of our high school partners in the two academies which surround Paris, which are the Académie de Versailles and Académie de Créteil. Not lunch yet.
Let's go.
Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Aline, for that. That was really useful to see another perspective on the issue. So we've had, obviously, those 3 presentations. So I'll now open it up to questions. As with Peter's session, I think we'll take 3 at a time, please. And if you could say who you are and where you're from for the purpose of our panel, that would be very helpful. So, Kathleen, shall we take you first, please?
Thank you, Kathleen Hood, University of Edinburgh. Thanks very much for all the presentations. I was going to ask John for some clarification. Thanks, John, for attempting to show the impact, because we all know, everybody in the room knows how difficult it is to equate the outreach to what actually happens. But there was a figure missing for me in your presentation. So you do outreach to 120,000 people. You have 35% attending events who apply to you. How many is that? Because you only get 15,000 applications a year. So in terms of the actual impact, how many actually apply and how many get in?
Sorry?
Shall I respond now?
John's going to respond straight away to that, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I mean, the 120,000, I mean, many of those interactions are individual interactions where you go and visit a school and you give a presentation. So the actual number on events is far smaller. The 35% is based on a sample of 12,000 students attending our initiatives. So it's a much smaller pool when it's over a 5-year period. So yeah, the number's far smaller.
Okay.
Right, thanks. So that would be about over 1,000 then.
Yeah, I mean,
15,000.
Exactly. I mean, if you, I mean, things whittle down quite quickly, and because we select from the top 1% of the population, I mean, the number that are admitted to Cambridge tend to reduce quite quickly. But for example, at this moment in time, there are about 170 students at the University of Cambridge who attended Sutton Trust summer schools, for example.
Okay, I'm going to stick rigorously to my 3-question rule this time. So, Janice, do you want to go next?
Hi, Janice Kay, University of Exeter. This is a related question for John. So you mentioned in terms of your evaluation that you were at the highest ever rate, I think, of state school. So how does that translate into other measures like low performance, low participation neighbourhoods? So last year, I think there was a 2% increase in the most economically disadvantaged quintile. So how does Cambridge compare with that?
Yeah.
And then a related question. In all the measures that you're doing, which is fantastic, I just wondered whether you used your students as ambassadors.
Okay, we'll come back to that. Thank you. Question from Nick at the back there.
Thank you. Nick Hillman, Special Advisor to David Willett. I just wanted to mention 2 things that respond to things John said, but it would be very interesting to hear an international perspective on the 2 issues. And the first is, please don't read anything into the government position on this, but the OFT inquiry into higher education has been suggested might look at the fact that you can't apply to Cambridge and Oxford at the same time. And it would just be interesting to get your response to that view, because I don't think I've ever heard either Oxford or Cambridge say anything about it since the OFT announced their review. And secondly, the Cambridge Access Agreement has been criticised in the past for focusing too much on the state-independent split, and you yourself focused on that figure. And of course, there's a very live debate in the UK, and it may be true in America and France as well, about whether what matters is school type or school performance. And your presentation focused very much on school type, and I'd just like your response to that. Thanks.
Okay, can we take one more, please, as well? Tessa?
Tessa Stone, Brightside Trust. This is a question for Aline. Forgive my ignorance of the French context, but you mentioned that your programme has had sort of ratification from the French government, and I just wondered how live an issue politically social mobility is. You know, is it as much of a hot potato in France as it is certainly in the UK and in the US as well?
Okay, thank you. John, do you want to take the first questions from Janice on the non-state school measures and the participation rate for other groups?
Yeah, so I said that our state sector applications were at their highest level ever. I think the same is true of LPN applications. LPN, for anyone who doesn't know, low participation open to the bottom quintile in relation to the Polar 2 measure of participation in higher education. Last year, our applications to that group were up by 3%. This year, they were up by a further 2%. So those numbers have been increasing. And actually, if I can just link that to Nick's question, second question about the targets we've set ourselves. I mean, the state versus independent measure is riddled with issues. There are very good state sector schools and there are some very bad independent sector schools, and so to cleave a line between the two is probably not a very good thing to do. But one of the problems that we have is we're always dragged back to this particular argument. If the press ever has a story about University of Cambridge admissions, it's always using this measure. And every time we try to move away from it, we're pulled back to it. And that's essentially why we have a target in that respect. But we do have a secondary target, which is based on our admissions from low participation neighbourhoods. And that's a measure against which we have been making progress over the last few years. So our targets aren't purely in terms of state versus independent. And it's worth saying that in terms of the way we look at our admissions process, we use a range of contextual data. People assume that if you apply to Cambridge, then it's going to be based on your interview, and that's that. Actually, we place an awful lot of emphasis on your performance in public examinations. UMS scores in AS level are very, very important to us. We do use interview. We interview about 80% of our students, but we also use a range of other criteria. So we look at Polar 2, we look at output area classification, which are postcode measures of representation in higher education. And all of these add to our holistic assessment of how far a student has had to travel to get the A-star AA that we require for entry. And it gives us a sense of whether one student's had all the benefits that their school could confer, and whether someone's had to really struggle to get their grades, and that helps inform the decision that we actually take. But we don't have a target set in those terms.
Okay. And while you're speaking, would you like to talk about the fact that in the UK you can only apply to either Oxford or Cambridge, sort of Nick's second point?
Yeah, well, I mean, the rule of combination has been in place for at least 2 decades, so I can't really speak to the history of it, but what I would say is that if the rule of combination didn't exist, their admissions processes would not be able to cope. I mean, we receive 15,000 applications a year anyway. Oxford receive, I think, 1,000 more than that, 2,000 more. So, I mean, in terms of actually interviewing that number of students, the process would grind to a halt. But just to reflect on the wider sector, there is a similar rule in place for medicine for very, very similar reasons. And of course, all students are restricted to 5 choices. So this rule of combination, although the focus is always on Oxford and Cambridge, actually there are a number of other restrictions in place on students applying to higher education. And so, I mean, if that rule is one that is deemed to be unsuitable, it does raise issues in relation to the whole process. I mean, we're yet to have that debate, but the rule of combination was there so that we could actually give each individual applicant the level of assessment we currently give them. And if our rate of application doubled, it would be very hard to look at the range of data that we currently apply to each individual application. So we actually think that the rule of combination is WP friendly.
Okay, thank you. Rebekah, there was another question from Janice on the involvement of students in outreach work. So it'd be interesting to get a Yale perspective on that, and actually also on the issue that, you know, would it be acceptable in the US to only be able to apply to Yale or Harvard, for example? I mean, would it work overseas?
Well, maybe I'll take that question first, because, of course, students applying to US universities can apply to as many as they want, and they do, 20, 30, we're seeing the numbers grow. So the only limiting factor on application really is when universities have early deadlines and sometimes binding decisions. So if they're admitted, they have to go to that particular university. But otherwise, there are no limitations there, and I think that's why we're seeing the numbers. We're seeing 30,000 plus these recent years. In terms of ambassadors, I did talk, you know, we do use our students a great deal. They are one of our most effective tools in outreach because, of course, they are having the experience. And so sending them out, we do pay them, but I think they do it anyway. But they love reaching out back to their own schools and going to new places. But if you can set up an ambassador program, it's been really effective for us, and we know that students are applying to us because they've met students through the ambassador program.
Okay, thank you. Aline, there was a question for you specifically on the sort of the political environment in France, I suppose, but any other comments on the questions would be welcome as well. So.
Yes, I think the ambassador program is very, very useful to say to other students that if an older student made it to come to an elite university, then the other one can do it. And our program is based on that also. Social mobility is also a hot potato in France, actually. And the figures globally show that students from elite university come mainly from high-income family in Dauphine and for other elite university globally. That's why the French government set up in 2010 a program called Cordée de la Réussite, which aims at funding local initiative. So they give to a specific couple, high schools and elite university, public funding to launch Programme Égalité des Chances and to try to build bridges between high schools and elite universities, which is, I think, really the core problem to open access to elite universities. So the program is mainly funded by the government, which funds a very, very local initiative since 2010.
Okay, thank you. Shall we take 3 more questions? So Richard at the back there.
Which Richard?
Richard Murphy, sorry, beg your pardon. Too many, yeah.
Hi, it's Richard Murphy from London School of Economics. In fact, I've got 2, but they're quite short questions. First to Rebekah, the Yale system seems amazing, but how much does it cost Yale, and how do you fund it, and how would you recommend other universities to fund it? And to John, how much do you think that early applications that are needed for Oxford and Cambridge affect in access to Oxford and Cambridge? Because students have to know they have to apply early, and it's not part of the standard UCAS process.
Okay, great. We'll work along the Richards then to the next Richard, if we may.
Richard Dufresne, Pathways to Law. It's also to do with finances, and it's aimed at, I think, all 3. We've heard about 3 models, different student support models today. Rebekah's the fantastic, generous Yale one, which must rely heavily on a significant endowment fund, which I should add I was a very grateful beneficiary of many years ago, so thank you. John, the one that Vince Cable described this morning, one we're very familiar with, and Aline, what appears to be a system of highly subsidized fee levels. There's a subsidy coming, there's a headline fee coming from I suppose I'm asking three of you, which, if you're going out and doing your outreach, which would be the one that you would feel most able to convince the students whom we've heard this morning are very certainly financially sensitive? What would you feel most confident about being able to sell to them as a good model that should encourage them to come into higher education?
Okay, thank you, Richard. And I think next to you, Simon had a question as well.
Thank you. Simon Willis, University of York. This is a question for Rebekah. Rebekah, you mentioned the Questbridge programme, which, if I understood rightly, is a kind of dating agency between disadvantaged students and selective universities. And I wonder if you could just tell us a bit more about that and whether you think it's a model that might work in the UK.
Okay, thank you. So if we start with Rebekah, if we start with you and Richard Murphy's question on Yale and what it costs you to run this programme of outreach and this programme of financial support.
Yeah, I don't know the total figure cost. Of course, we are one of the few offices in the university who actually, we bring in money, of course, through our application fees. And while we offer fee waivers to whoever needs them, it's still a fairly substantial amount of money coming in. So I know that supports some of our outreach. Internationally, we're probably, I mean, in terms of travel alone, probably spending 100,000 or more every year. I mean, I just know that figure. But in terms of outreach for your own schools, and I mean, unless there was sort of an application fee, or I would say using students more is probably the easiest way to kind of start doing that. So that's what I say. I'm sorry I don't have overall figures for that.
Okay, thank you. And John, on your view of the impact of the early application deadline.
Yeah, well, I've heard the proposition before. I mean, there are several things to say. One is that the current application deadline for most students is 15th of January, but of course it used to be earlier. It used to be 15th of December, and the only reason why it was shifted backwards was essentially because of Christmas post, which is something that's kind of become irrelevant now in this new high-tech electronic age. But the deadline used to be earlier, and so the 15th of January deadline is actually an artefact of a situation that existed a long time ago. I guess my response is that the majority of students begin their higher education preparation around about March in year 12, and they apply in autumn when they've just gone into year 13. So there's something like a 6-month period. And even in my experience, and I used to give presentations at 100 odd schools a year, even the schools that were less prepared and less well resourced had their programme in full swing by April, and they were going to HE conventions, they were visiting universities and going to open days. And so I'm not really sure I buy the argument that you're further behind, because the window is actually quite wide. And again, I would just reiterate the point that the reason why we have an earlier date is to accommodate a process which is necessitated by the fact that we receive so many high calibre applications, and we need to differentiate very finely between very, very able students. And in order to do so, we feel that we need to look at a whole basket of attributes. And were we not to do so, I think that would be more damaging to widening participation at the university.
Okay, thank you, John. Aline, there was a question around the 3 different models of funding we've heard about this morning. Which would you feel most comfortable in advocating to low-income students?
Maybe a few details about the fees, which are very low in Dauphine, because legally we cannot raise them. Actually, Dauphine is the only elite university which is public. That is to say that we are directly under the authority of the French higher education ministry, and the other elite universities, which you probably know, Sciences Po, HEC, other business schools, are private. So they can have fees, normal fees, I would say, around 10,000 euros a year from first year until 5th year. In Dauphine, we are a public university. That's why we cannot raise fees in the first 3 years, and in the master degrees we cannot put so high fees we'd like to do. I know that the wish of the president and the executive committee of the university would be to have reasonable fee around what our partners do in France, and to increase the amount of scholarships so that the low and middle income families can be helped. These fees are not really a choice for Dauphine. It is imposed by the French government, actually.
So would you, from what you've heard this morning, would you prefer to move to either the English system, the loan system, the income contingent loan system, or the Yale endowment, which funds this needs-blind admissions process?
Definitely. In Dauphine, we used to say that what is free has no value. And it's quite true. So if we could, another time it would be fee should be different whether your parents have low or middle or high income, and really reflect the cost of the studies, and of course have a generous scholarships. Just like, as far as understood, Yale and Cambridge created, so that every able students can apply in Dauphine and afford actually the fees. It would be the ideal.
Okay. John, any thoughts on whether you'd like a multi-billion-pound endowment to fund that?
For me personally, or
well, for you personally, or for the university?
Well, I mean, there's a kind of utopian ideal, and there's a hard pragmatic case to answer, and it's very difficult to marry the two. I mean, I don't think that any university would want to be charging students £9,000 per year. I think most would like to go back to an older regime. But the hard fact of the matter is that the government removed a teaching grant, and they said, we don't want the burden to be on the taxpayer, we want it to be on the beneficiary, the student. And so the issue that universities were confronted with is either taking a very big financial hit in order to keep the tuition fee low, which will then affect the experience that the student has at the university, or to charge the fee and to use a proportion of the additional fee income to encourage other groups through the system. I mean, we are lucky that we are able to offer a pretty generous bursary package to students. And I mean, if you came from a very low income background, say you came from a background where you would be technically eligible for free school meals, if you combine the bursary that we offer with the grants and the loans that are available for maintenance from the government, I mean, you would get quite close to amassing a sum that was equivalent to your family's household income. So, I mean, for certain groups, actually, the package can, depending on where you apply, can be quite generous. For middle-income groups, I'm less convinced, and I think that, I mean, there's a lot of talk about the squeezed middle, but there are some families that are very hard-pressed by the new arrangement. I am in awe of some of the packages offered by American universities, but we don't have the endowment, and so it's very difficult for us to replicate. But, I mean, I think actually, when talking to students from low-income households, I think we've actually got quite a positive message to convey, and I think that's reflected in the fact that our admissions have gone up from LPNs. It becomes more difficult in that middle ground, I think.
Okay, thank you, John. Rebekah, any thoughts on that? And there's also the question of Questbridge and fleshing that out a little bit for us as well.
Yeah, with respect to Cambridge, I think dating service doesn't quite capture it, but basically the way it works is that it works in the same way as students applying to residency programs after medical schools. So if a student puts Yale at the top of their list and we put them at the top of our list, then the match happens. But obviously if that doesn't happen, then so you can see how that works. But basically, students applying through Questbridge have to be able to qualify for a full scholarship to the schools that they're applying to. So for us, that would be less than $65,000 per year income. The application itself is actually different, so it includes much more contextual information. We have questions, much more financial information in the application than we would ever see through the common application. They also have them write biographical essays about background, family, all sorts of things. So the context is there. The teachers are also asked to tell us lots of different things about the students that we wouldn't necessarily find out through the normal application process. Would it work in the UK? I mean, I don't see why a program like that couldn't work, but then of course it's tied to the fact that we are offering full scholarships, so that's a whole piece that I don't know how that would be worked out, but it's been extremely effective for us.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. I think we've got probably enough time for maybe 2 more rounds of questions. If I could take 3 more, please. Just making sure people who haven't spoken. So, Anne-Marie first.
Hello, my name is Anne-Marie. I'm from King's College London. It was really great to hear about Yale's quite innovative, tailored communications that are targeted at those lone wolf students, let's call them that we're particularly worried about. And it seems to me that there's a great deal of opportunity in terms of how we communicate with students, both online and offline. And perhaps we haven't fully capitalised upon that here in the UK. So I wondered if the panel could offer their reflections in terms of the opportunity it offers us. And also, it was interesting to hear about John's the SMS campaign that was run in the US and the ways we could maybe implement that here in the UK.
Okay, thank you. And Jude as well, please.
Jude Heaton from Teach First. Your 3 institutions all are looking for slightly different things in the pupils and in the pupils you're trying to recruit. So I'm interested in terms of what that means in terms of what the content of your outreach looks like and what particular barriers that represents. So, for example, for Yale, if you're looking for somebody who might not have the same academic profile but might be a great mayor of a local town, how do you help somebody to recognise that potential?
Okay, thank you. And then one more, just Graham, and then we'll come to Stu later on.
Graham Atherton, Access HE. My first question just for Aline and then moving on to the rest of the panel. I noticed in your presentation that you had mentoring for the students when they entered Dauphine. Well, I'm interested in this country, we have less support for students from disadvantaged backgrounds when they enter HE specifically. One of the arguments being that stigmatises the students when they enter. So I'd like to know your views on that. And I'd like to ask whether John and Rebecca have specific support for learners from disadvantaged backgrounds, etc., when they enter your institutions, not for the whole cohort, just for those particular students and what it might be.
Okay, thank you. So maybe if we take Anne-Marie's question first about the lone wolf students and how we can better communicate with these students. Rebecca, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the mailings that we've been doing, which you saw up there, we hope they are going to be very effective. I think it's more sort of, if you're very clear, giving outlines of this is how you do it, and having something in hand rather than having to search for it online works particularly well. Online, I mean, we have a very strong Facebook presence, Tumblr, Twitter, all of these things, which of course we get our students to do. So another way in which we reach out is we have lots of students employed in our office who are answering questions and maintaining our online presence. But I think one of the things we also offer as part of our financial aid packages is work on campus. So students know that they can make some pocket money. And there are more jobs than students, so and even if you're a non-US citizen, you can work on our campus. So that's another thing that students can make use of. Access to faculty. I mean, there's lots of things that you can talk about. So.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. John, is there anything from the Cambridge experience about how best to communicate with students and to find these individual students in schools?
Well, it's been said on a number of occasions that US universities are able to write to bright students and encourage them to apply. And I mean, having spoken to colleagues at American universities, I think that's true to one degree or another. We had one encounter with one minister who's really quite assertive in his suggestion that we should pursue this in the UK. The problem's actually very mundane. It's data protection. A student would need to give permission for the examination board to pass their details on to UCAS, who turn would need to pass the details on to the universities. If I knew the name and address of every student who reached a certain grade profile, either at GCSE or AS level, then I would be quite inclined, I think, to send them a missive. Although I do worry about the amount of mail they get from 120 odd UK HEIs each year just after they've got back from their summer holidays. They wouldn't be able to open the front door when they came in. But it's just not, I mean, there's a very boring explanation as to why we don't do that. And if that issue could be resolved, then we would certainly consider it, I think. In terms of communications more broadly, I mean, I was quite interested to hear the suggestion that we SMS students, because we engaged, I think these things move very quickly, but we engaged in a major scoping study 2 or 3 years ago into use of new media, because we want to make sure that we were communicating as effectively as we could. And people were saying to us, I've heard of this thing called Twitter, people are tweeting apparently. I didn't know they were doing this, but apparently they're all at it, and we should really get involved. And I mean, things do move on, and I think as new modes of communication bed in, people become more open to using it in different ways. But the reaction we got was that you really shouldn't be using things like Facebook or indeed mobile telephony to do your marketing, because people forget they've signed up for it, and they feel that you've invaded their personal space in some way. And what initially can seem like a great idea can actually become really quite irritating. I've received my 5th text from Cambridge University this week telling me that I should be doing something, when what I really want is them to leave me alone, because I thought I'd got a message from a friend and I've got something far less interesting. I think that was 3 or 4 years ago, and I think quite probably they're becoming more receptive because it's in more common usage. But I think there's a really interesting piece of work for someone to do in this area. And we did it because we felt there was a dearth of evidence. But I think there'd be a really interesting piece of work for the sector to engage in there, just to see what the best ways of engaging with students. I think UCAS has done some work in this area, but not deep work in this area.
Okay, thank you, John. Aline, there was a question also from Jude on the profiles, and the fact that your universities are probably looking for slightly different profiles of students and how they are best selected. So maybe you could say something about what you do at Dauphine.
It's very difficult to answer that question because, on the contrary to Cambridge, we do not have any interview to select our students. That means that we are just considering the grades the pupils have before A level. That means in our première and terminale in high schools. So we do not really determine a profile, and the profiles are really guided by the grades the pupils have in the high schools.
So your selection is based principally on the grades, really?
Yes, only on grades, except for our partners, those programs.
Okay, Rebekah, from a Yale perspective, how does Yale find the students it thinks are best? How does it select the students it thinks are best suited to their university?
So our process, as is the same with many US institutions, is highly contextual and very holistic. Approximately 80% of the candidates applying are academically qualified to come to Yale. So then pieces like the writing, the teacher recommendations, community and school-based involvement, the interview become very, very important. And those are the pieces that can really separate students. I think one of the biggest questions we're trying to ask is, have you as a student made the most of what's been made available to you within your environment? And that includes your school environment, because I mean schools across the US are all different. And so we want to make sure, obviously, that they will be able to thrive in the Yale curriculum. But if they've made the most of what's been made available to them, and I'm not just talking academically, talking about extracurricular opportunities, going above and beyond what's right in front of them, I think that's how we really can recognise a student's potential and how they will contribute to Yale and how they will take advantage of Yale.
John, from a Cambridge perspective, does that chime with your process?
Yeah, I mean, we would say that our process is also holistic. We do rely heavily on performance in public examinations. We look at AS grades, we look at the UMS scores within those AS grades, and that gives us an initial picture. We tend to rely on those more than, for example, teacher predictions, because it gives us a sense of academic trajectory, particularly if you take that against GCSE scores. We interview 80% of all students who apply. That's for a different reason, and that's really to enable us to actually assess whether, it helps us assess the kind of opportunity that was available to a student. It also gives us a sense of whether the student has lots of polish and shine, but not necessarily talent, versus someone who's actually got a lot of talent, but not necessarily, who's not necessarily come as well prepared. But we take into account, as I've mentioned before, a number of measures in relation to the neighbourhood from which you come. We look at GCSE score of the school. We look at the rate of applications that we've had historically from certain schools. So there's a whole bundle of things that we take together. And that does kind of inform the way we conduct our outreach work. The majority of our work is focused on bright and able students, because those are the kind of students that we want to admit to the university. However, there are some activities that we do just because there is a merit in conducting that kind of widening participation activity. So, for example, we've got an Aim Higher successor programme that operates in Cambridgeshire that we're central to. We know that many of those students won't apply to us. And indeed, if they are bright students, they may decide to go somewhere entirely different because they're already very close to Cambridge, and maybe somewhere else is a better idea for them. We do a lot of work with care leavers. In terms of attainment, care leavers are much less likely to get higher grades, so we know that the throughput to the university will be lower, but we feel that it's something that we just should be involved in. So there's that distinction. We could, if we wanted, to put more emphasis on focusing on those neighbourhoods those low participation neighbourhoods, but we don't exclusively focus on those because it's just a measure, and it comes with flaws. So there's the ecological fallacy. Just because you live in a certain postcode, it doesn't mean that you share all of the characteristics with everyone else who lives in that postcode. So all of these things do have a bearing on how we conduct our outreach, but we try to have quite a broad spectrum of activities, so we're hitting lots of different groups rather than focusing quite the way you might think.
Okay, thank you. I think we've just got time there's one other question we need to answer, and then it's 1 o'clock, so it's lunchtime, I'm afraid. So there was a question around mentoring, and particularly mentoring for current undergraduates as well. So Aline, would you like to say a word about that?
It's a very interesting question. The question of stigmatization was, of course, the question when we launched the program in Dauphine. There was very hot debate in the Dauphine community. Actually, we had two statements. One, those students do need help to succeed. That is true. They need a bit more help than the average student who comes to Dauphine. And then, second statement, we need to follow particularly those students to be sure they succeed. So those were the two arguments for us to say, okay, so we install a sort of mentor system, and we try to install the loosest system possible to give the mentors and the students a lot of liberty. So liberty, but ensuring that we follow the students all the first year to be sure they succeed, and to give liberty if they succeed without us, very good, and they live their life in the university. And so we install those 3 mentors, an alumni, to help for the first summer job, the first internship, the first thoughts about professional career and everything. A teacher to help with academic problems, and a student to help with the integration in elite university, which is not very, very easy for somebody who comes from a disadvantaged suburb in Paris. But it's a hot topic, and still right now we wonder if we do that the right way, actually.
Okay, thank you. Rebekah, does Yale do any mentoring of non-privileged undergraduates at the university?
What we do is, I mentioned in the presentation, we have a program which we actually just started last year called Freshman Scholars at Yale, which is specifically targeted to students whose level of preparation may not be quite adequate for when they're coming in their first year. It's a 5-week program. We fly them in. No student has to pay for this, but of course it is quite a small program at the moment. But they end up with a writing class, writing credit, so they've made that up by their first year, also in quantitative reasoning, and a lot of advice on how to approach the college experience. So it's not just academic preparation, there's lots of preparation in other ways as well. But aside from that, we also have a lot of advising. I'm a freshman advisor, so we can assign advisors to particular students as well.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, John, from Cambridge's perspective.
Yeah, well, I mean, our emphasis has always been on admissions because we perceive that as being the area where the most work needs to be done. In terms of student success, our success rate is something like 98.5%. I mean, it's one of the highest retention rates of any UK university. And I think the reason why our retention rate is so high is because of the collegiate system, supervision. Students receive very, very close attention. They're very well supported. And I mean, I guess it's almost semantics, but I mean, we talk about mentoring, but actually you engage with your tutor in your college on a daily basis. So it's a very similar kind of principle. So I think it's actually embedded in a collegiate system.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm sorry, there's a few of you who still want to ask questions, so I'm sorry we haven't got time because it's just gone 1 o'clock. But our panellists will be around over lunch, so feel free to collar them then. But just before we head off to lunch, which will be in the room out there, could you just join me in giving the panel a round of applause for a very...